Part 3, Chapter 30 of If All These Young Men by Romer Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 3, Berkshire. Chapter 30, Pathetic Fallacy. The people came out of the house door, mysterious in the fading light, like a procession of Boccaccio's women and a clerk of the Decameron, seen through the romantic distance of 700 years. They lit the candles in the dark garden room and sat round as if waiting for somebody to begin a story. Overhead the blue sky gleamed through the gathering darkness, and in the west a rosy glow spread up behind the delicate aspens and maples and acacias of the little plantation above the yew garden. Up in the mazy blue sky the transparent half-moon and a few bright planets gleamed beneath the outermost heavens, where faint white constellations began to appear as the darkness quickly gathered upon the earth. The people in the garden room sat quiet for a little time, then one of them spoke. "Do go on, Josephine," she said. "There is no more to say," Josephine replied, and lay back deeper into her chair. But Chloe importuned her, so that with a sigh she sat upright and spoke. Charlotte watched her intently, but not more intently than Sebastian, who, with his hands folded upon the bowl of his pipe, reclined in a low chair at her right hand. She did not wish these people to stare at her any longer, and she had no longer a desire to make a declaration of her creed. However, she said, "Why, I think we will all become leaf mold, and then clay, and then coal, and then diamonds, like forests, if we have not enough energy to carry us through to the end. I am thinking of the notion of original energy. We outbid the white ants for the earth once. Are we to die off without having one turn round heaven? It seems to me we shall know soon." Susan came and sat down nearer Josephine, but she was not even intellectually interested in Josephine's talk. She felt that she wanted to be near her, as she always did when danger was about. "Nevertheless," she said, "did we outbid the ants?" "So I have heard tell." Sebastian shifted himself in his chair and lay further back in it, with his long body at sharp angles, his knees touching and his feet close together. The noise of his chair creaking made Josephine look round at him, so that he blinked in the flickering candlelight and smoked in a leisurely fashion, to pretend that he had not been looking at her. "That particular kind of white ant is to be found in Africa," he said, making a statement. "It is," said Josephine, and slowly turned her head away. She looked over at Horatia, who sat as usual in a corner, smoking, with some work in her lap, ready to be taken up later. "None of them have any sympathy with me," thought Josephine, but she went on speaking. "Life is a mad business. It seems all dreams, and when we get a fact or a truth, it slips into the past and is lost. We know little enough for certain except the I amness of I, but what that may be we can't tell. We don't know our dark minds. We are strangers in ourselves. I am an optimist. Some aren't. But I don't know what on earth I hope for, except that it is right down here I hope, not after death. I hope we shall win clear of darkness. I think I believe in the impossible. If we lose the game, what of it? I don't care. Those who think it may be won are always part of the victory, even if it is lost." Josephine got up. She felt that it was impossible to sit in the chains of those glances any longer. She must go out into the garden, but before she went, she said, as if she were very angry, "I don't care what you may say to me about pessimism or skepticism or determinism, I simply won't listen to the arguments. I know beforehand I can't refute them, so I cut them right out." "Oh, if you will cut out a whole side of life," cried Susan, also angrily. "They make me feel deathlike," Josephine replied. "There is nothing but facts and deeds for me." "But what are facts and what are deeds?" cried Chloe. "Illusions?" asked Josephine. "The common sense of ordinary folk is good enough for me, and if ever I have a philosophy, it's there I shall begin to look for it." Josephine at this point stopped speaking and went straight out of the garden room onto the terrace, to the place whence she could see the river and the railway line down in the valley. Sebastian wished to start up and follow her, but he lost his chance to be spontaneous and found himself unable to move. He watched Josephine come back along the terrace and go down the little steps into the rose garden, and again he wished to follow her, but he let his chance go, and when she was lost to his sight, felt lost himself and exceedingly weary. The rose garden was full of darkness. Black shadows hung in the air and crept along the surface of the grass. And as Josephine walked under the high yew hedge, dark gossamer ghosts floated about her. When she had walked all round the garden, she crossed to the fountain and stared down into the black water, where the half moon and a few stars shone hard and bright. She looked up, and in the sky above saw their pale reflections. The fountain seemed to her a hole in the floor of dreams, through which dream creatures such as herself could look down at that sharp clear sky under which wars were waged and civilization dwelt in cities. She wished she were down there. She was tired of this vague, dreamy, moonlit paradise, and though it was one of her fantasies come true, and though she was already prepared to abandon it, she had only owned it for half an hour. She shook herself suddenly and said, "My God, this is not the right place." But she was not conscious of what she meant. Presently she left the fountain and, going out of the garden on the east side, began to walk up and down the dry grey lawn. She was out of touch with reality and ill at ease among dreams. She could neither visualize ordinary life nor feel or hear the war, which was still the center of human life, though it was working to its conclusion. She strained herself to return to the world where it went on continually night and day, as we sometimes imagine the departed dead strain themselves to return among the living. In the war, deeds fell straight on deeds. In the world, actions ultimately brought results, but even after 1,000 years of waiting, nothing would happen. No reply would echo back to anything she might do or say in these empty, misty fields. She strained her mind again and tried to visualize the ordinary aspect of everyday life. And as she struggled against the limitations of human capacity in an endeavor to conquer the world, she clasped her hands tightly together, and her face became as ugly as if she were passing through the agony of suffering for humanity. She owned the country, and she owned the town. She owned the past and the future. But now she passionately longed to own all the people in the world, to be able to go everywhere in her own person and to be loved. It seemed for an instant that she could attain her desire by an intense effort of will, and for some time she stood quite still and forced herself to recognize the immense width of human consciousness. And then suddenly men and women appeared simple, and life appeared simple, as if behind all the diversity of existence there was a single truth. She lost her sense of unity instantaneously and began to cry like a child. There was a shadow between her and every day, an unconquerable spectre which loomed up huge and terrifying. She did not suppose for a minute that it was her own ignorance or her youth or her own heart. She believed unquestioningly in the supreme power of the human will, and therefore she attempted to see in the shadow some enemy from outside. Presently in her memory she recollected shadows she had seen before, shadows of clouds upon hills, shadows passing over the sea, and all at once she seemed to be at an evening party, and to be watching a shadow pass over James Blanchard's face. She sighed and raised her head to meet the fears which were coming over her. She thought she had been a coward ever since she was born, and would not be a coward again. Thoughts of Sebastian came to her as if to offer her help, but she shook them off. In order to live she would have to be brave enough to do without help, because she must do without fear. At any rate, she thought, I have myself. I'll make myself the best I can. No idea of good or bad came to her mind. Best did not appear to her as good, but seemed rather a part of that which has found its expression from time to time in the unexceptional work of the human mind and hand. She had stopped crying, and after a minute or two she moved and became natural. She felt happy, and at once wished to go up to the house and make somebody come out into the garden to look at it in the moonlight. She sang a snatch of a song and ran up into the garden, hoping that Sebastian would be brave enough to leave the Sharps and come down into the orchard and kiss her. She sang a few bars of a love song, and wished very much that he would be able to break away from the restraint of all those people and come out with her. She thought, "I'll kiss him madly." But when she got up to the garden house and looked in at the people round the table spread with patience cards, she became embarrassed, and said as calmly as she could, "Isn't anybody coming out into the garden?" Some of the Sharps looked up and smiled, but nobody answered. Then Sebastian jerked himself straight onto his feet and said, "I am, Josephine." Josephine was sure that everybody must now see clearly what there was between Sebastian and herself, and she bowed her head to receive their condemnation. But as Everett Sharp cried, "Don't get lost, you two," she found courage to brave Charlotte's thoughtful eyes, and laughing back to say, "Oh yes, you will not see us again. There is a ferry cab waiting for us in the orchard." As he followed Josephine into the orchard wildness came into Sebastian's heart, and he felt as if he were swiftly pursuing on wings something that escaped him. He did not know where he was. He seemed to be dissolved into a new element, and to have left the sediment of himself behind in work and the war, whose unfinished ends stood out above him like huge unfinished walls that he was building alone. He forgot everything but the desire to follow the thin, strange, dark creature who went a little ahead of him through the yew archway into the orchard, and made up his mind, if the chance came, to capture her. She was not like anybody he knew in the world. She was mysterious and elusive, and in the darkness and weariness of his brain the sight of her caused a maddening and insistent pain, as if his intellect were struggling against exhaustion and annihilation. Suddenly he found her in his arms and kissed her passionately, but before he had entirely realized what he was doing, she was gone again. He thought she was not material and had vanished, then saw her slipping away among the apple trees and followed her. There she went, in and out of the white patches of moonlight, and though he followed her quickly, he did not overtake her. He thought the apple branches and the long grass were holding him prisoner. He shouted, "Josephine!" and she stopped, and in a minute he came up to her, but he was not quick enough to catch her. She swerved, stooped, and picked a narcissus, and before he had time to speak said, "It is getting wet in the hemlock. Smell this." She held up the narcissus for him to smell, and laughed a laugh such as he had never heard. Nobody had ever laughed like that before. It was surely the finest thing in the world. He seized her wrist with his left hand, and as she put up her other arm to balance herself, seized her other wrist, but she twisted herself out of his grasp with a schoolboy's trick and sprang away. She said angrily, "You are not to do that with your horrid strong hands. It hurts." "It doesn't hurt if you don't twist," he answered, and if he had not been so tired would have hit her on the head. "I say it does," she replied. "It doesn't." "I tell you it does," she cried, drawing in her breath as if she were sobbing. "I am sorry," he murmured. There were many other things he would rather have said, but he wasted the opportunity, and the next minute found himself following her back to the house. He had no command over her and could not detain her a minute. She was as wild as an elf. Nor had he any command over himself. He had lost it in her, and must capture her to get it back. She went before him straight into the house, and, sitting down beside Charlotte, said, "Let me help." "Do come and join me, Josephine," said Charlotte, making room for her at the patient's table, and Sebastian sat down in a chair as near to her as he could get, stunned by her heartlessness. The Jackson queens and kings entered his mind, and their quality of having the same aspect both ways up fixed itself in his brain until he felt it to be a fundamental truth. Josephine played on for about half an hour until the game was ended, and to him the half hour was 30 times 60 interminable seconds. He watched every move of the stupid game he did not understand, and in the intensity of his concentration played it with the players from where he sat as if his life had become the cards and his continuity in the world depended on being shifted as they were shifted. At last it was over, and Susan said, "I am going to bed, and it is time you were in bed, Josephine." "Soon," said Josephine stolidly, and settled back into her chair. "Sebastian, it's time you went to bed too," said Everett. "I think I shall take a turn in the garden," he murmured clumsily. Both he and Josephine remained sitting, but all the Sharps stood round them in silence for one instant. Then Everett laughed and cried out, "Oh, really, you two?" "No, leave them if they want to sit up. It is dreadful to be driven to bed if you do not want to go," said Charlotte, and Josephine perceived that she was consciously hurting herself in the name of the family for the sake of other people's freedom, and knew that the rest of the Sharps would have acquiesced. In order to give color to his wish for walking in the garden, Sebastian got up as they said good night and went on to the terrace, but directly the last of them had gone indoors he returned to Josephine. She rose and said softly, "They will hear," though he had not spoken. "Josephine," he whispered, and put his hand on her shoulder. "Yes," she replied, "I know." They stood quite still for a few minutes in silence, and then Josephine said, "Charlotte sleeps here. We will have to go." "I am going away to-morrow," he answered. She seemed kinder, and he put his arm round her neck and kissed her gently. "We had better talk upstairs," she said. She could think of nothing else to say. "Come in now." All at once he became patient and followed her into the hall, where Everett was still sitting, reading by the fire. "What? Over already?" cried Everett. "What is over?" asked Josephine. Everett laughed. "You two idiots." Sebastian stood in the hall long enough to gather his wits together and light his pipe, and then he went very slowly up the stairs in a state of bewilderment. Josephine was not in the least surprised to see him standing outside her door when she came upstairs a moment later, but she did not say a single word to him, and merely warned him by a look to go into his own room. She went in at her bedroom door, and presently Everett came upstairs, knocked on Sebastian's door, and called out, "Good night, Sebastian." Josephine heard him answer, "Good night." End of chapter 30, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.